Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm very pleased to have with me as my guest Mike Keys, who's a partner at Dorsey and Whitney. Mike, welcome to the program.
Richard, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
So, Mike, you have one of the more unusual backgrounds I've come across. You were a classically trained, pianist. Tell me a little bit about, what age you started and how you got started and how far you went with that.
Sure. So I came from a family of seven kids, and my parents thought it was important that we all took music lessons through high school. So every one of us studied piano all
Hmm.
the way through high school, and I was the one out of seven that decided to kind of pursue it a little bit further after high school.
Interesting. Well, what were your parents musicians? Do you have a musical family?
Well, I guess musically by force, I suppose, or by persuasion is probably more like it. So my parents were not particularly musically inclined, but really thought the value of an education in music is kind of unparalleled, and
Huh.
so I'm really pleased that they inspired us to continue with it all the way through high school, and then in my case, beyond high school.
Yeah, interesting. Now, most kids would rather be playing in the yard and doing things than practicing piano. But was that you, or are you just something you really enjoyed?
Well, I must admit that when I was younger, I wasn't as disciplined in practicing as I should have been. But
Huh.
as I started getting into high school and started seeing the various applications that music could bring, I started getting more and more interested, and then decided to pursue it as a degree in college.
That's amazing. Now, were you thinking about a career as a musician at that point, or what were you thinking?
Well, I always had an inclination towards law. I found it pretty interesting. My father was a judge,
Oh,
so we had a lot of interesting legal discussions around the dinner table and otherwise. So that was something that I always was interested in and
huh,
thought, well, maybe I'll put that on hold and pursue that later. But for now, I'm going to pursue music studies.
huh. But you weren't thinking about music as a career, or were you?
I wasn't sure.
Hmm.
I wanted to take it as far as I felt like I could take it in terms of my studies and see what opportunities I would have. And then there was a natural point of demarcation where I felt, okay, I think I've taken this about as far as my talents can take me, and maybe now it's time to retool and go to law school.
Well, tell me, how far did you take it exactly?
So I received a bachelor in music and piano performance from Loyola University in New Orleans.
Hmm.
And then after that, I studied for a year at graduate school in Tbilisi, the Tbilisi State Conservatory. And I studied under Maestro Nodar Gabunya, as you and I had communicated offline a bit ago, Richard. So Professor Gabunya had come to Loyola in a faculty exchange program. And my senior year, I ended up studying piano with him, and I really, really enjoyed it. He was a really wonderfully talented, trained in the Moscow Conservatory in the kind of the golden age of Moscow conservatory studies, and had a lot of great insight, and I thought was a wonderful professor. So I went and studied with him for a year.
Interesting. Did you?
So I got there. It was in 1993. So a lot happening in the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union at that point. Georgia had seceded from the rest of, or the southern part had seceded from the northern part. So there was a lot of civil strife associated with the living conditions there. But it was one of the best years of my life and one of the most challenging years as well.
Interesting. Did you do any piano competitions or anything during your studies?
I did as an undergrad.
Huh.
And then I participated in a number of class concerts, and one of the highlights of my trip in Tbilisi is that we played on a nationally televised concert, and the ambassador to Georgia actually attended. So that was kind of
Hmm. Hmm.
a fun event for us.
Did he think you were one of the best students he'd ever had, or what did he
Oh
think about you?
no, 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 for sure not. I mean, he had monstrously talented students that went on to have fabulous, international careers and performance careers and so on and so forth. So I was, I was just along for the ride, I guess,
Yeah.
in one
Huh.
respect.
Did you do a lot of, I'm just curious if you did you do much piano in the way of piano concertos with orchestras? Because that always seems like something very challenging to do.
I did. I actually played the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto.
Oh,
And that was probably the most challenging piece, and you're really getting to the outer limits of my pianistic abilities with that sort of piece. For
oh,
me, it was a massive piece in the repertoire to play, but it was a real joy to study it. And Rachmaninoff is such a phenomenal composer.
sure, for
It
sure.
was really fun to participate in that way with that
Which
piece.
orchestra did you play that with?
I played it with my Loyola University Orchestra.
Oh,
So
wow.
I participated my senior year in a one of the competitions I competed in was the concerto competition. So it was a
Oh,
school-wide competition, and the winner would end up playing the concerto with the orchestra. So
interesting. Now, which one is number two? The number one is the dun 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 dun. That's the most famous one,
um,
isn't it?
so that's Tchaikovsky.
Okay.
Um, and so that's the yes, that is the Tchaikovsky concerto, the very famous. I think it's in B minor,
Okay.
or B flat minor,
Okay.
as I recall. Um, so the Rachmaninoff second, that's the one in C minor. The very famous Rachmaninoff concerto, and by far and away the most difficult one is the Rock 3.
Huh. How's that one go?
Oh boy, there's so many different melodies. I might embarrass myself trying
Okay.
to sing it here on your podcast.
Okay.
Maybe you can put it in the show notes.
Okay, very good. So what do you think the hardest piece you ever studied was as a pianist? Or do you recall? I mean, I'm sure these are all very hard.
Oh,
Just curious.
probably, certainly the most difficult piece I ever played and performed was the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto.
Yeah, okay, I'm
Like I
sure.
said, that really was the outer limits of
No.
my ability. And so, but I studied other pieces, didn't perform them. Like studied the Beethoven Hammerklavier Sonata, one of the most difficult piano sonatas Beethoven ever wrote, probably the most difficult.
Hmm.
Um, so I studied some Liszt pieces, but never really was serious about getting those up to snuff, ready to perform.
Now, as I mentioned to you before, I actually was a classically trained pianist. I took piano for
Yes,
probably 11 or 12 years. The thing
right.
I actually found most difficult, or one of the things I found most difficult was memorizing. I was never good at that. And that always just tripped me up. I mean, that kind of limited, I was always worried about missing notes and then and slipping. And anyways, was that a problem
Yeah.
for you or that was never a problem?
I mean, there were a couple of performances where I had some memory slips. One in particular where I actually just kind of had a whiteout experience, but was able to finally finish. That is
Wow.
kind of terrifying, as you probably recall when that
Yeah.
happens. But by and large, I actually did okay with memorizing. I mean, I spent a ton of time, as all pianists do, in terms of
Mhm.
really studying. And I had a teacher that once taught me, memorize a piece from the back going forward. So you kind of do it in reverse. So you start with like the last measure and add on the last few measures. And
Oh,
so
man.
I actually used that technique quite a bit when I was
Hmm.
memorizing music, and I found that it worked for me.
Interesting. Um, do you still play today? Do you play at all now?
I still play. It's more, I actually have played at our firm retreats and,
Oh,
office gatherings and these sorts of things. All three of our kids, my two daughters play violin, my son plays piano. And so when they were younger and studying music, I would work with them. And my daughters and I actually had a little trio called Keys and Strings because they played violin, I played
oh,
piano. So we'd
yeah.
go and play at various events, charitable and otherwise.
Did you ever try your hand in any music composition?
Oh, a little bit. Nothing particularly serious
Yeah,
or
yeah.
noteworthy, but yes, I think we all kind of, as musicians, sit around and try to plunk out melodies and come up with some interesting chords and other things. So yes, in that regard, I have.
Did you do any formal recordings or professional studio recordings of any of your works?
Um, so I mean, I recorded all of my performances.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
Um, and yeah, I guess we were in the studio a couple of times recording, but I never like officially launched any CDs or
Yeah,
other
yeah, yeah, yeah.
recordings.
Interesting. What about other instruments? Have you ever learned any or play any other instruments?
I mean, I played guitar a little bit. I
Uh-huh.
picked it up and kind of self-taught, but nothing worth writing home about for
Yeah,
sure.
right. Do you kind of practice the piano these days, like just tinker on it or anything like that?
Still do a little bit, yes, for sure. I mean, I'll sit down, I'll hear something, want to sit down and play it, or I'll hear a Brahms piece and I'll think, oh, geez, I remember when I used to play that, and sit down
Huh,
and
huh.
try to play it, get frustrated, and then stop.
How good's your sight reading? Look at sheet music and just play it or read it and
I
play?
I can. I actually am still pretty decent at looking at lead sheets, for example, that have the melody and the underlying chords, and I
Oh
can
yeah.
I can more or less make my way around a number of different versions of
Yeah,
music.
yeah.
Sitting down and reading a Mozart sonata or something like that would be a bit of a challenge for me, just because I haven't really done it. That's a
Yeah,
skill that if you don't use it, you lose it.
yeah, yeah, definitely. So what made you decide you felt like your musical career had reached as high as it could go?
I actually have a very distinct memory of the day
Uh-huh.
when I had always thought, and I'd approach this is I'm just gonna keep going, and I'm gonna know I'm gonna have the feeling that okay, maybe I've gone as far as I can go. I was at a rehearsal. This was the spring of 90, I think it would have been the spring of 93.
Okay.
I was at this rehearsal for these kids that were 10 years age and younger. They were participating in a piano concerto competition. And so I'm sitting there watching these young musicians. All of them were fabulous, and they would get up, and one by one, I would think, okay, yep, that young kid is better than I am. Yep, that next kid is better. So I had this epiphany, like, okay, maybe it is time for me to think about venturing into the legal world. So
Yeah, interesting.
I decided I finished my year of studies there. I had the opportunity to go back and complete my studies the next year, but I thought, you know what, I think it's time to go to law school. I
Mm,
think I've
mm,
really enjoyed, and I'm always going to have music, and sure enough, I still do. Not to the same extent. It's a little bit different, but I'm glad looking back that I made the decision I made.
Was Nodar Gabunya, was he disappointed in your decision?
Not at all. I mean, we had a great relationship, and he was a fabulous teacher. And he shared his insight with me. He said, I think you would be a fabulous teacher. I don't
Huh,
think you'll ever
huh,
be, the type of pianist that's going to make a living by
huh,
concertizing throughout the
huh,
world.
huh.
So, I thought that was really good advice. And I still thought about, well, I'd still like to do that potentially. But, after reflecting and speaking with my parents at the time, I decided I think
Huh.
it's now or never for law school.
Now, how'd you figure out what area of law to study then? I mean, it didn't sound like you were thinking about it much. It was kind of your backup plan. You said your dad was a judge. How did you know what kind of
Yes.
law you wanted to do?
Well, I actually really got into copyright because as a musician, of
Oh, right.
course, copyright is the vehicle that protects musical work. So
Right.
I really had an interest in copyright, and that led to natural outgrowth to trademark and advertising related litigation.
Hmm. And what about litigation? Is that something you kind of just gravitated towards? Did you always envision yourself as a litigator? Because obviously you could have been a transactional licensing lawyer or something like
Right.
that too.
I did. I really liked, making arguments about infringement, non-infringement, and
Mhm.
really getting into the cases and being able to craft arguments and put together, evidence and make arguments to a judge and jury. That was something that I always found pretty appealing and
Hmm.
still do.
So is most of your work trademark, or you still do some copyright music stuff too?
I still do quite a bit of copyright.
Hmm.
It depends on what cases come in the door and when. But I'd say probably right now my mix of trademark to copyright is probably 75 trademark, 25%
Okay.
copyright.
Uh-huh. So one of the other interesting things I noticed in your background is you actually went back and got a master's degree in survey research and data analysis. I assume this is after law school. Actually, yeah, it's way
Yes,
after law school. You
way
just
after
recently
law
did that.
school.
Yeah. What
Yes.
what motivated you to do that? Most lawyers don't go back in for graduate degrees.
So in trademark cases, one of the key pieces of evidence that we develop a lot is consumer survey research.
Right.
And so we go out and we retain survey experts to conduct this research and data analysis and then present that to the court. So I get really interested in that area, that particular discipline, and
Hmm.
I decided, you know what, I'm actually going to go and study it in earnest. I mean, I had
Huh.
studied it as a lawyer and working with a lot of great experts for the last 20 plus years, but then I decided, you know what, I'd like to really dive into this and
Huh.
become a survey research expert myself. So I went and it took a few years to get the work done. but I was able to work it with my caseload and my family commitments and otherwise,
Wow.
and
Huh.
completed it. And so now it's another facet of my practice. I'm doing consumer survey research as well, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, interesting. Well, how does it help your practice? I mean, do you find it's really helped your practice?
I think it's really helped in terms of developing an expertise and
Hmm.
being able to explain for clients how important this piece of evidence is and how we really have our handle on it, both in terms of not only the legal end, but the practical end of being able to conduct survey research and really be able to critique the other side and really make sure that this evidence is being developed in a way that's consistent with generally accepted principles and practices.
Did you have to do some kind of master's thesis for that master's degree?
I did just coursework.
Huh.
So I was able to complete all coursework and electives. There were a couple of significant papers that I had to write, but not a thesis, as
Hmm.
it were.
Hmm. Was that degree completely remote, or how did you do it to the it looks like it was University of Connecticut. How did you do
Yes,
that from where you
yes.
live?
It was all remote.
Oh,
Of
interesting.
course, there were various aspects that were, sync, asynchronous, but then you'd also have, online classes together, meetings with professors, and so yeah, so it was mostly online, and so
Hmm.
there were aspects that you could schedule around your own schedule, which was really welcome news because I frankly I couldn't have done it otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. Do you represent a lot of musicians or anything as clients?
I have.
Huh?
I mean, more both on the trademark, more on the copyright side.
Uh-huh.
But like I said, now my practice has tended to be more heavily on the trademark side. So not as many musicians that I've represented in that capacity.
Yeah, yeah. Was your dad pleased with your decision to go into law instead of being a musician?
I mean, he was supportive, but
Hmm.
he really liked the fact that I was operating outside of the box and wanted to be a musician. So I think he was a little disappointed at first that because I had put in a lot of time and sacrifice, and my parents, of course, had dedicated a lot of resources
Yeah,
to
right.
doing what they could to support me. So, uh, but they were supportive regardless of what I decided.
Well, the nice thing about piano and music is that you can always maintain it as a side hobby. It's not like you have to give it up.
Definitely.
So you can keep doing that, as long as you're practicing or doing anything else.
I think that's exactly right. And now, we have three kids. Our youngest just graduated from high school, and so we're going to be empty nesters here in the next, I think it's 68 days, but who's counting? Uh, and so I'll maybe free up if I can find some time outside of practice obligations and otherwise to study a little bit more because I really do have fun sitting down and learning new pieces when I have time to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Mike, this has been a fascinating conversation. I knew you had a super interesting background when I saw it, and I really appreciate your taking the time to share it with me.
Well, I'm so grateful that you reached out, Richard. It was really fun to learn about you and your background as well.
Terrific. This is Richard Hsu and Mike Keys. Thanks.